Welcome to Pressure Point. I'm Brad Newcombe. In the 1920s, the United and Anglican Churches in BC established schools of theology on the campus of the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. And then in 1971, a vision to create an ecumenical school to train leaders for ministry came to fruition when the schools merged. With me to talk about theological education, past, present, and future, is Dr. Bud Phillips, who is the principal of Vancouver School of Theology. Welcome, Bud.
Thanks, Brad.
Well, one of the questions I have is, when we hear those words, theological education, some people may say, what's that? Others have very specific ideas. What do we mean?
Well, it's a good question because it's changing. Theological education is 160, 200 years old, maybe more than that in North America, but it's the preparation of people for the specific role of ministry in many people's eyes. Theological education means a certain body of knowledge studied by an individual to form and shape their lives into becoming pastors.
So is this specifically to train pastors?
It was originally, and it still carries that meaning and that value. But now theological education is thought of much more broadly than that. It's the kind of training that people take, the kind of education people undertake, or the kind of learning that people gain from various sources in order to prepare them to be theological thinkers and to think and to feel their lives theologically.
Oh, well, okay, I've heard that a long time, like to think and feel your life theologically, do theology. I've had a hard time translating that into sort of the nuts and bolts of day-to-day living. So help me, give me an example as to what that means.
Well, for instance, some people have an idea of themselves as being a human being and a person and in relationship and so on. Others realize that there's more to it than that their lives have a relationship with God, with the understanding that God brings into the human society. People understand themselves differently if they think of themselves theologically. Also, they think of the world differently. They think of the relationships differently. They think of the actions and activities of society differently. If they see them not just as human people bumping into each other, but a process of life and vitality that has meaning and purpose theologically in the eyes of God.
So when you say theologically, you're really saying, in other words, approaching life with the sense that there is God, and this God is in relationship with me and the world.
That's right.
Okay,
yeah.
Great. Well, that's a good one. So now we started in 1971 with this vision that created Vancouver School of Theology. Anglicans and Uniteds, and I know others have joined since. Well, the world changes, the world moves on. How has theological education moved with it?
Well, you said in the introduction that there were two schools on the UBC campus, at least two schools of United Church and Anglicans, and for a number of years they existed side by side on the campus, just within a stone throw of each other.
And also the UBC campus.
On the UBC campus, right. And they were training people for Anglican ministry in one place and United Church ministry in the other. And then in the 50s and 60s they began to share their faculties, and their students went back and forth across the halls, and their libraries were intermingled. And before long they realized they could be doing this together for the most part. And so in 1971, you remember that, you may not remember, but I do, in 1971, there was a real thought that the United and Anglican churches would join together. And right up until 1970, that was beginning to be a very real possibility. And then it fell apart in 1970. But the school was already moving toward, schools were already moving toward each other. And so they just kept on with it, even though the churches decided not to do that. So that was the beginning. It was an effort to save resources, to bring people together who were studying together anyway, but formalize their program, and to develop a kind of new curriculum, which was very different in Canada. It was called a competency model, and instead of just taking courses, students were expected to actually prepare for certain competencies to make them ready for ministry.
Okay, well, how do you get ready? How do you get ready to be a minister? Where do you go? Where do you sort of plant your feet?
Well, first of all, in the 1970s, or 71, 72, many people came to theological education, to the theological school, with all kinds of background in the church. They'd been born and raised into families where the church was an important part of their lives, and they'd gone through Sunday school and church groups and youth groups and choirs and everything else, and they later came to theological school, perhaps 27, 26, 25 years old, and studied for the ministry. That's changed now. But in those 1970 days, that was the expectation, that it would be young people, mostly men, coming into the ministry after having been acculturated into a theological life through their church. by the early 1970s and a little bit after that, that was beginning to change. More and more people were not having that kind of upbringing. And so in that first decade of the Vancouver School of Theology's life, things really began to change. People began to come back to theological school, or come to theological school after another career. I remember in 1977, I had a class full of people who were, in fact, had been out of a high school and university for a number of years and then decided to come into the ministry. They were 35, 40 years old.
So what happens in people that make those kind of major life decisions? I mean, that's a real shift.
Yes, it is.
What happens in their life to impact it to that extent, to leave their job and uproot their family and come to study about God in a school at UBC?
Well, for many of them, it is a dramatic change in their way of thinking. They've been thinking that life is about making money and getting a family and home together and getting on with whatever it is that they're doing. And then they began to think there's more to life than that and more meaning in their lives that they need to find shape for. And so many times people have had a dramatic change in their lives. Some people call it a religious conversion. Some people are Christians already, and it's not a religious conversion, it's a conversion of the way of thinking about what I'm supposed to do with myself and how am I supposed to use my gifts and talents. But for many people, it's a dramatic thing. And for some, it's just a gradual feeling that this is what I should be doing with myself. These are the things that I can do. I can teach, I can lead, I can help people understand, I can interpret, I can engage other people, and perhaps the ministry is where I should go.
Well, I can't imagine that that has changed all that much, in the sense that when people end up studying theology, they're driven by deeper meanings in life, deeper questions. But how we do that may be different. How are you doing that differently now?
Well, when the Vancouver School of Theology was formed in '71, there was very little field education, for instance. Students did most of their training in the school. Now we do a good deal of the training out in the churches, with our students out there spending hours every week in all 3 years of their training, or 4 years of their training. They spend a lot of time reflecting on what's actually happening in the church.
What is happening in the church?
Well, dramatic changes are taking place in the church.
And are there many people there?
Well, there are in some places large
yeah.
numbers of people, and in other places the churches are in deep trouble. But the students are constantly watching that and bringing that experience back into the classroom while they study biblical studies and history and theology and so on, to get a larger picture of the body of knowledge that's needed to keep reflecting on the life of the church and what it's meant to be.
So with their experience of going out there into the churches and meeting everyday people who are struggling with keeping their jobs, or maybe they've lost their jobs, or making all kinds of decisions, how to deal with a gay or lesbian son or daughter, or having abortions, those kind of things, what kind of questions then do they bring to you in the school? I mean, those day-to-day gutsy stuff that we all face.
Well, they bring the questions of why, first of all. Why is this? What is causing this? Why do people react the way they do? Why should we live with one another as we are? Why should we struggle with these questions? They bring the why questions, but they also bring the what-if questions. What if the world were different? What if our relationships were more honest, more open, more direct? What if people really took seriously the claim of Jesus Christ that we should love one another and care for one another and give ourselves in service to one another? What if we took that seriously? So they bring the what-if questions into the theological school too. And then they really ask questions about what are the fundamental truths or understandings from Scripture and from the tradition of theology that we can take back to the church and help the church think again what it's supposed to be and do in this day and age.
Now, and I always like asking, I'm one of those people who loves asking questions, just like you're talking about. But I also know it's really easy then to get stuck in my head.
Yep.
And so how do we, and I know that people who are attracted to sort of university or college type places, it's easy to get stuck in your head. How do you help people get out of the head and embody some of the sort of more practical ways of meeting with people?
Well, one of the mythologies is that people in theological school are living in some other world somewhere. In fact, when you put 160 people face-to-face with each other in various configurations, they're not all there at the same time, they come and go, and some are commuting and some are, I mean, you put that many people together, you have a kind of pressure cooker. They're all trying to study together, they're all trying to get their lives together. Some of them are working out of the school and coming in for only short times. They are experiencing life as it really is, and they're dealing with one another, and they're having to bring that to the table and say, why are we dealing with each other this way? Why are we relating? Why am I having so much trouble with that person? Why am I finding that person so attractive, and yet I'm married and committed and so on? Why am I doing? What's going on here? And what's going on here is part of what theological education is all about.
Right. So we start with who we are and where we're at, and so on. Now I know you've got some interesting projects there. One of them being issues around the Pacific Rim. How are the Japanese students, for instance, involved in the community?
Well, it's not just the Japanese. We're dealing with the whole sense that this culture in which we're preparing leaders for the church is changing. And if you look at our own society and our own community, we know that the future has got to be much more multicultural, much more attuned to what people bring and live with in their lives. And so it would be irrelevant for a theological school in the Pacific Rim not to be engaged with people from Korea and Taiwan and Hong Kong and other places. And so we're deliberately working at that. Now that's a real difference between 1971 and now.
Huge difference.
A very big difference. And what it also means is that we have to keep looking at this changing culture and saying, how do we prepare people to go into the churches now and be engaged with what the issues are for the people in the church now, rather than what it was 15, 25 years ago.
And of course, I think one of the big ways in which we do that is to actually meet with people.
Of course.
You know, to actually know people. I mean, that's been my experience, is that the more I get to actually know people, whether it's of other religions or no religion or cultures, but just that takes away some of the mystique. It makes me feel more comfortable to ask the bumbling questions that I have, you know, those kinds of things.
Yeah.
Just wondering, so now what are some of the things that you do? Also, I mean, there's other areas. I mean, there's the Pacific Rim. You have the Native Consortium. I know that you've done issues around sexual orientation. So those are all pretty vital kinds of ways of being together. Right. So how does it mix?
Well, first of all, there's two different levels at which you have to think if you're going to think theologically. One of them, you have to think about the reality of all the things you mentioned. We live in a culture where the Native people have a right to challenge the culture around us and the culture around them. They have a right to call for justice. We're living in a society where women have had to struggle and are still struggling for their rights and their freedoms and their safety and security. We live in a society where, in fact, gay and lesbian people have not been understood and have been they've caused fear in other people. At least they haven't caused it, but there's fear there. We live in a society that is just torn apart in many ways. And so that's part of it, to be real about what is happening in our lives, to recognize that those are the issues. But then to back away from at least a bit and every once in a while and say, what is it that's underneath all of this? What's underneath prejudice? What's underneath putting people down? What's underneath abusing other people? And you know, fundamentally, the Christian faith has some words for it. It's an old-fashioned word, but it's still significant. It's sin. It's the failure of human beings to be what they were created to be what God intended them to be. And when you start thinking that way, you're thinking theologically. You're saying there's a reason for this, and it has to do with people's relationship with God.
Okay, but again, and I again, not underestimate the importance of thinking, but I want to move into some doing. Yeah. Because I sort of like those two things to go together and then come back and think some more. Okay. Okay, so that's the kind of way I like to do it. And I know that I've been parts of, say, workshops on understanding racism. Yes. But the problem is that the people who come to those things, in some ways, it's already have moved to a certain point where they're interested, and maybe sometimes we need to, and there's other areas where I would need to go, I'm only going to go to where I've already got a sort of interest. But to really affect change in each of us, we sometimes have to be in places where we don't feel comfortable. So how do you help people to either go to those places or meet with others who might be in those places? Is that a clear, was my question clear?
Well, I'm not quite sure, but let me try something with you. It seems to me that if we had to go to those places intentionally, many people wouldn't go. I mean, you don't have to. If you can live your life in kind of a sacred space and avoid all of that. Right. The church confronts people with that. The church invites people to come together. The church calls people into community. Right. And many people in the church don't want that either. They would like their church to be separate from all of that. But there are many significant leaders in the church who say that's what the church is about, reaching out to change that kind of separation of people. And I think the kind of people we're training to be leaders in the church today know before they leave the theological school that part of the job of leading a congregation today, part of the job of being a Christian in a community today, is not to walk away from those issues or to hide oneself, but to face them head on. Not only to talk about them or think about them, to actually do something about the breakdown in human relationships, about the failure of our society to treat people with justice and honor and respect.
And okay, one of them is the economy. I mean, that is a big issue, you know, the fear of unemployment, the growing disparity between rich and poor in this country, often issues that are hard to talk about, that are very personal and threatening. Well, and yet at the same time, if you go to visit the downtown east side, you just see, you know, the human cost to many of those kind of issues. And I know I'm kind of simplifying it, but what I'm trying to get is a picture of how you help people through those things and to help others.
It would be simple if the church was in one place and the world was in the other, but the church is in downtown Vancouver, it's in West Vancouver, it's in Shaughnessy, it's in Burnaby. The church is in all of those places, and so it isn't like it's out of touch with those things. What we need to keep trying to do, and what we're trying to prepare people to do in the theological school, is to understand that belonging to that community of faith we call the church requires that we find ways of linking and relating and being in touch with. And even though we may live in one community, we still care about the people in another community, and care in some significant and personal and often sacrificial way.
But I mean, one of the things that I sort of wonder about is when people have never been a part of that community, the people who don't go to church or whatever group it might be, but that's the community we're talking about. If people don't go to that, it's easy to say, it's easy to sort of talk the talk, this is a welcoming and inclusive community, but how do you then go from talking the talk to walking the walk? And if those people have never experienced it, they don't even think about any kind of interaction.
Well, you're touching on something that's really quite different now than it was even 25 years ago when the Vancouver School of Theology was formed, but certainly 10 years or 15 years before that. The church was had a different relationship with its culture and its community in those days. And there was more feeling that the church and the community were kind of one, or the church and the community was pretty much on the same value wavelengths. Over the past 25 years, that's changed radically, and many within the church would say, in fact, they are often out of tune with the values, the issues, the concerns that are being raised in society, or they want to take a different position, they want to take a different stand, they want to be heard in a different way. But the church is a minority, a very serious minority in our society, and so it has trouble being heard. It has trouble being heard on the university campus, it has trouble being heard in the community. And unless it becomes political, the church doesn't often have the kind of energy for change and the kind of leverage for change that it used to have when its members were also the members of the leadership of the community.
What are some of the strengths in being a minority? I mean, what are some because I mean, we often have to, all of us in life, we have to sometimes turn what seems like a disadvantage into an advantage, or all those kind of sort of ways of turning things around. But there are also, I mean, let's face it, I mean, Jesus himself, he died on a cross, and that group of followers who were transformed, a tiny group of people, from very frightened men and women into very bold and fearless disciples who went on and helped to touch and transform the world through the Spirit. So, being small is not the worst thing in the world. Maybe that's how sometimes we can do the most.
Well, that's probably true, but I think we'd have to be honest to say that in our highly politicized world, being a minority is a pretty tough spot. It's a tough spot for all minorities, and I don't think we should pretend that we can, make lemon out of a lemonade. The fact that the church doesn't have the kind of voice and strength and power that it once had is a problem. Because the values and the faith and the commitments and the energy and the vision and the hope that is a part of the church is not being heard in our society, and I think it's unfortunate. Now, being a minority, however, does make you realize that you need one another, and so in some ways the people who belong to the church now are people who are there because they really share a deep sense of belief. So there's an integrity within a smaller group like that maybe wasn't there when everybody belonged or when everybody felt they should belong, and so on. So there is some value, I think. But the fact is the church today and leaders in the church today have a pretty tough time expressing and interpreting the gospel to a society that's pretty indifferent to it, quite uninterested.
Well, that was my next question, is then, if this minority is so dispiriting and challenging and, you know, almost powerless, how do you prepare leaders to go out there and be energized, passionate, committed, not to get burned out, discouraged, and give up?
Well, I think you're hitting on an important part of what we're trying to do. The training of people for the ministry today is the training for people who are going to be facing pretty difficult odds.
Maybe not even being able to work full time.
Often not fully employed, that's right. Often not sure they can be called to a church. There, in the mainline churches at least, there are fewer churches these days. Churches are closing, and so many of our graduates struggle to find a place to work.
But that seems less important than what the original question
You
is,
bet.
this
You bet.
passion to be able to be energized.
Well, I think that the church needs leaders. The church needs good leaders, and the church needs dedicated leaders, people who aren't going to back away from a difficult task. The major task, I think, we used to think of the church as being a place where people could serve and be served and so on. I think the church now needs to be gifted interpreters. We need women and men who not only understand the depth of theology and the Bible and the history of the church and the traditions and have skills as counselors and so on, but they have to be really good at interpreting this faith to a community that doesn't understand even its roots, let alone its deep meanings. And I think the task of the theological school these days is to prepare people not only so well that they understand these things, but to also teach and help them learn to be interpreters of that, communicators of that, apologists is the old term, people who can really explain what this means in a day when it isn't obvious to people.
Now, and I mean, how do people teach that when they've come out of the same? I mean, when faculty have been in the system, in that stream, where, you know, we're raised and trained in a different sort of worldview, the one we're talking about. Where does one get the insight and the experience and the
well, we all
wisdom?
change. We all change. I was a pastor in the 1960s in the prairies, but if I were to be a pastor now, I wouldn't be the same kind of pastor. There would be other things that I would be doing and things that I did then that I wouldn't be involved in.
What would some of those be?
Well, for one thing, when I was a pastor in congregations in the 60s, I was dealing with people, by and large, who had been raised in the church. And so I could count on a certain kind of way of thinking, and I could count on certain language and certain idiom and certain ways of dealing with people. I don't think you can count on that anymore. You've got to deal with people often using language that is not theological language, not traditional church language, to interpret the faith to people who understand it only when they begin to see it in their idiom or their experience and so on. I used to do a lot of that with radio when I did that kind of work, and now I know that in fact in the ministry today, and our graduates need to be able to speak about faith without necessarily being caught in the old language of faith, because people aren't comfortable with it.
That's right. Well, you used a word earlier in this interview, which is one that would make a lot of people feel uncomfortable. You talked about this is sin.
Yeah.
Okay, translate that for me now.
Well, you see,
I'm just intrigued.
I don't. Do you want me to translate sin without using it?
Without using it.
Okay. When I become suddenly aware that I have wronged you, I have thought less of you than I should have thought. I've put you aside because I didn't take enough time to find out who you really are and what you were trying to say to me. Now, sometimes I can just be cold and indifferent and don't give a darn about that. But every once in a while, somewhere inside, I suddenly become aware there's more to our conversation. There's more to our relationship. Or when I have laughed at a joke about someone that isn't funny, but I've laughed at it because that puts that person down, it puts me up. And then I back away and I say, that's wrong. There's something wrong about that. That's not true. It's not fair. What I'm feeling is what that word would mean. I'm feeling a loss of that relationship that was meant to be, that God intended in the human creation and relationship, but it's not there. And I've contributed to its loss. Then I have sinned.
Right.
I've fallen away from what might have been if I had just been the kind of person I was intended to be. If I just cared enough and been open enough and listened to that voice that speaks of truth and love and caring. And that happens so often. And we know better, but we don't pay any attention to it because it's easier for us.
Oh, of course. And there's all kinds of reasons why we just sort of go along with the sort of
Now,
flow.
the theologians have a long and important description of all of that, and why we do that, and what's underneath that, and what that can mean. And the theologians help us understand that. But then we have to be able to take that knowledge and go and help people understand what it is they're doing that has changed. You know, when we look at the news these days, and we know that there's something deeply wrong in our society, it's important that we maybe have words for it, but more importantly that we respond somehow. Mm-hmm. That we do not back away from the reality that somebody has to change this. And it may be you, it may be me.
And then it also, I mean, it seems to me from what you're saying then, it's also you, and it's me, and it's in partnership with others, no matter who we are or where we come from. I mean, is that part of the, I mean, the vision, because in a sense you talked about how in the 50s the United and Anglican were together and they just did their own thing. And they came together, well, isn't the vision sort of not to homogenize us, but to sort of
No, that's right. It's not
interact.
To homogenize it. It's to recognize that there's real dignity and value in what each of those denominations bring. And the Presbyterians joined us in 1984, and there are other denominations that, and we're not about meshing all of that into one mush. What we're doing is saying each of those traditions is a gift to the other. Each brings some aspect of the faith to reality, so that one denomination brings a passion for social justice, another brings a passion for worship, another brings a passion for preaching and teaching the Bible, and all of them coming together makes them stronger. And we know we need one another. We know that it's not a value for us to be separate and isolated from one another, to be antagonistic or to be competitive. It's much better for us to find a way to benefit from each other's gifts and to use them in changing the community in which we live.
Well, when you say it all like that, Bud, I mean, I don't think nothing sounds discouraging or dispiriting at all. I mean, that sounds very exciting.
Yes, it should be exciting. It is challenging, and even though it's a difficult task, I mean,
that's what we're about.
There's lots of difficult tasks.
And unfortunately, we're out of time. It feels like we're just getting going. But I want to thank you so much for being here and sharing not only the vision of Vancouver School of Theology from beginning and into the future, but also some of your own insights and examples as well.
Okay, thanks, Brad.
It's been great. I've been talking with Dr. Bud Phillips, who is the principal of Vancouver School of Theology, and we've been talking about theological education and theological language and so on, past, present, and future. Thanks for watching Pressure Point. I'm Brad Newcombe.
The preceding program was produced through the facilities of Rogers Community 4, Vancouver. We want to hear from you and invite you to leave your comments and suggestions on our 24-hour response line message machine. Please call 731-5812.